I'm Simon Hardy. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology and course leader for media and cultural studies.
So Simon, what type of questionnaires are there?
There are a number of different types which can be divided according to the method of application. So you can use, some people use telephone questionnaires, some people use postal questionnaires, which have the disadvantage of having a relatively low response rate, and other people apply questionnaires in face-to-face interviews. So you can divide them according to the type of application.
So what kind of information do you tend to get from questionnaires?
What you're looking for is quantitative information, which can be easily analysed, easily codified. So you're using questions which really try to get a yes or no answer, perhaps, which seek factual information about the person who's being questioned, or who seek opinion. You're sometimes looking for people's opinions as well.
Okay, so why would a student use a questionnaire then?
Again, to get relatively large scale quantitative information out of a particular sample of subjects who you're applying the questionnaire to.
Sometimes students get a bit confused with closed questions and assume it's qualitative information. Can you just explain a bit about that?
Now, a closed question can't produce qualitative information. It produces information which can be easily quantified. So again, it'll be a yes-no answer perhaps, or possibly a multiple choice type question.
And what about open-ended questions as well?
Open-ended questions get you into the area of qualitative responses because you're allowing the subject, the person filling in the questionnaire, to provide their own answer rather than having a preset answer. So their response can go in a wider range of different directions. But again, within a questionnaire, you're going to use a fairly short space to allow that response so that they won't become too extended.
So it's still quantitative information?
It's still information which you can broadly quantify, yeah.
Okay, so why should students do a pilot?
It's important to do a pilot because this is the way you experience, you test out the value of your questionnaire. When you first design the questionnaire, there are certain important questions you might forget to ask, you might not have thought of, and it's only through the experience of doing the pilot that you learn that there are other questions you need to ask that you haven't thought of previously. And sometimes you can eliminate certain questions which just don't produce any kind of useful information.
Students often ask me, how many questionnaires should they do? What would you say to that kind of question?
It really depends on the kind of research project that they have in mind. It's going to vary depending on the subject that you're researching. But for a student-independent study, for the main survey, it's going to be more than if you're doing a qualitative piece of research. So you've got to have quite a decent number to be able to quantify. So you're talking about several dozen probably, anything up to 100.
Okay, and what can you tell students about doing questionnaires that might be useful to them?
Generally speaking, it's best to start off with the simplest questions, the very factual questions, perhaps questions about the subject's age, sex, occupation, those sorts of things which establish who the respondent is, and then to go on to the more open-ended type of questions later on in the questionnaire once the person sort of warmed up, as it were, and started to respond.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to talk about interviews. So Simon, could you tell me what kind of interviews are there?
There are different types. Sometimes you use an interview in order to apply a quantitative questionnaire of the kind that we've already been talking about, and sometimes you're trying to get a much more in-depth picture of the respondent's particular subjective views, their world views, their particular personal experience, and there you have a much more open-ended format where you're simply trying to elicit information from that individual in much more detail.
Now, Simon, I know you've used interviews in the past in your own research. Can you give us an example of how you've used them?
Yeah, I did some research on young men's use of pornography, and for that I used qualitative interviews, and partly what I was trying to do was to find out about the experience that they had with pornography. So the questions such as, when did they first come across it in terms of age, at what biographical point, what was the context of that, what did they think of it, why did they use it, when did they use it, etc., etc., all those kinds of things. But also I wanted them to interpret bits of written text for me. So I would give them a piece of text to read, and then we would go through the text sort of blow by blow, as it were, and they would explain what was going on and what they thought it meant, and so on.
And did you have a list of questions to ask?
Yeah, for the qualitative interview I had what I would call an interview guide rather than a schedule. And a guide just means it's a set of questions that you can kind of refer back to as you go through the conversation, rather than a schedule which forces you to ask questions in a certain sequence. And this meant that if people got into the flow of talking and they started providing information in answer to one question which I was going to ask about later on, I could just allow that to happen, and I didn't have to stop it. You could just allow that kind of free flow, and then I could kind of tick off the question because I knew I wouldn't need to ask that again later on. So more of an interview guide. It's much more free flowing. It can allow information to come out whenever it naturally comes out in the actual conversation itself.
Why would students use interviews?
If it's for qualitative interviewing, it'll be to try to get much more information about the person's subjective experience. Sometimes that's what you're seeking, particularly if you're coming from a more sort of interactionist type of perspective, which is interested in people's personal subjective experience. That's where you would use qualitative interviews.
And what would you say are the key issues in conducting interviews?
I think it's important with the qualitative interviews. It's important to seem interested in the responses that you're getting. It's important to seem unjudgmental. So you've got to come across, you've got to be permissive in your responses. You've got to allow people to say what they want to say without giving any appearance of judgment on your facial expressions or your body language. But at the same time, you need to seem interested as well. So obviously you don't want to look bored. And you normally wouldn't be, because funnily enough, when you get into these situations, when you're interviewing someone on some aspect of their personal experience, it almost always is interesting. And the thing is, in a way, is to enjoy them. It gives people a chance to talk about things that they might not otherwise be able to do with someone who seems friendly and open and who they probably won't see again. So it's an unusual opportunity for many people, and hopefully it can be enjoyable for both the interviewer and the interview.